Buenas noches, ¿cómo están? Bienvenidos a Edición Especial Digital. Mi nombre es Diego Acuña. Bienvenidos a todos desde donde estén a esta hora. Estados Unidos, México, Europa, Asia. No importa. Bienvenidos. Esta noche en exclusiva una conversación con el científico social norteamericano Steven Mosher. Es una entrevista que yo les había anunciado hace algunos días. Esta noche la presentamos en exclusiva en este programa. Steven Mosher es el presidente del Population Research Institute. Es una institución dedicada a promover la vida, a defender la vida y sobre todo a estudiar las poblaciones y a oponerse a políticas de control poblacional como la política china, sin ir muy lejos de un hijo solamente. Todo esto nació cuando leí recientemente un artículo de Mosher, que es un experto, entre otras cosas, sobre la China comunista. Ha dedicado décadas al estudio de las políticas chinas y tiene un entendimiento intrínseco, es un experto en el tema. Un artículo reciente que él publicó en el que anuncia el declive de China. El declive que a su vez significa el cese de la expansión económica del boom chino, se terminó. Y él lo sustenta con una serie de argumentos y de cifras que de por sí tienen que haber sido muy desafiantes conseguir porque, como sabemos, imagino que ustedes también tienen claro que las cifras a las que podemos acceder del gigante asiático no son muy confiables. El gobierno tiende a maquillarlas, a manipularlas y por consiguiente nunca sabe uno si está leyendo cosas que son certeras de lo que se emana de China, del gobierno chino, ¿no? Entre otras cosas hablamos de eso. Hablamos de la presentación de su libro, que acaba de ser publicado, su último libro, que se llama The Devil and Communist China, El Diablo y la China Comunista. ¿Por qué se tornó a finales de los años 70, tras una experiencia traumática en suelo chino, en un activista defensor de la vida de reconocimiento internacional? Mosher es una personalidad que da entrevistas habitualmente a medios norteamericanos muy conocidos, como, sin ir muy lejos, Fox News, Good Morning America, etc. Así que, sin más, vean la entrevista y la comentamos luego. Joining us now is American social scientist, author, and president of the Population Research Institute, Steven Mosher. Mr. Mosher, thank you for being here. Welcome.
Good to be here with you.
I want to start our discussion with this article that you've written on China, published in the New York Post, titled Communist China Had a Good Run, but the Party is Over. I have several specific questions, but before we jump into that, was it easy for you to come across the data, the numbers that you list here? Because the Chinese government is not exactly forthright about its economic information.
No, it's not. And so you have to understand, if you're a China hand, like I am, that all of the numbers produced by the State Statistical Bureau in China are fabrications. They are, without exception, false. And that means that you have to look behind the numbers and you have to understand what the officials are trying to achieve. They're trying to make the Communist Party look like it is brilliantly developing the Chinese economy and that there are no problems whatsoever. So every time the numbers come out, you have to look behind the numbers. In fact, we had a premier about 20 years ago in China admit that he himself did not pay any attention to the official numbers, that when he wanted to get a sense of how the economy was going, he would look at things like the amount of rail traffic, the amount of containers being shipped on container ships overseas. Those were real parameters by which you could tell how the economy was doing, not the fake numbers published by the State Statistical Bureau.
Right. Now, the central idea of this article is that basically the era of economic expansion of China is over and it has entered a phase of economic decline. You say that the Trump tariffs and COVID played, somewhat of a role there, but that the central factor behind this is President Xi Jinping's leadership. Is that correct?
Well, it is, because Xi Jinping, as he has said from the very beginning, is committed to going once more down the socialist road to ruin. He has effectively neutered and is gradually destroying the private sector of the economy. Now, obviously, the private sector of the Chinese economy, which is export-oriented, has been the leading edge of China's economic development over the last 30 years. But now, of course, all economic activity in China, not just the state-owned sector, not just the state-owned companies, but also the private sector, is now being brought under the control of the Chinese Communist Party. There are now political commissars on the boards of directors of all the companies in China of any size. And that means that if you're the CEO or the wealth creator who started the company 20 or 30 or 40 years ago, you now have a Communist Party minder looking over your shoulder and second guessing your decisions. Now, Xi Jinping has said he doesn't mind people making money in China as long as they use the money to serve the party. Well, the political commissars who serve on the boards of the major companies of China, nominally privately owned, are thinking to themselves, the best way they can make sure that the wealthy serve the party is by stealing their wealth and expropriating their companies so that they serve the party directly. And that's exactly what's happening. You see billionaires, you see CEOs, you see senior executives being arrested, being imprisoned, being executed on charges of corruption. Well, you could probably charge anyone in China with corruption because the system is basically a system built on corruption. But at the end of the day, what you're doing is destroying the only sector in China that operates on market principles. The domestic sector of the economy has been in the economic recession now for some time. You've got 65 million empty apartments in China. The people who would have filled those apartments, the young people who would have gotten married and had children and purchased those apartments, have been killed over the last 40 years in the one-child policy. China's population is now declining. So the economic decline is matched by the demographic decline and is all accelerated by the increasing move on the part of Xi Jinping to total control of the Communist Party over the economy, which, as I say, gives opportunities to communist officials to steal the wealth of wealth creators, and that always ends badly.
Now, another of the things you mentioned here is that his idol, President Xi Jinping's idol, is Mao Zedong. But you've made an important point there. If these political commissars are put there, it's an intervention, it's a state intervention in the board of private companies, then the obvious question I have is how private, in reality, is the private sector?
Well, China has never had a truly private sector because a truly private sector depends for its very existence on its separation from the government. It depends for its very existence on the rule of law, on respect for property rights, on respect for contracts. And China has never enjoyed that. Even during the period of rapid development in the 90s and 80s and in the early years of this century, China's never really had the rule of law by any stretch of the imagination. The judicial system is controlled by the Chinese Communist Party. The judges are Communist Party members who rule according to the advice, the directions that they're given by local Communist Party leaders. So it's been difficult, I think, for entrepreneurs in China to create even the semblance of a private sector under those conditions, and yet they have. You see, the Chinese people are the most entrepreneurially minded and hardworking people on the face of the planet. And if you give them half an opportunity to improve their lives and improve the lives of their families and their fellow Chinese, they will seize that opportunity as they have. But they have been, over this entire period, carrying on their backs, as it were, the entire Chinese Communist Party. 94 million members of the Chinese Communist Party make a living off the wealth created by the other 93% of the Chinese population. That's how the system works. And about a third of the wealth of China every year is consumed by the Chinese Communist Party in corruption, in its foreign junkets, in its lavish lifestyle, in its resorts, in its conferences, in its banquets, all of that. A third of the wealth of China is consumed every year by the Chinese Communist Party, disproportionately by the senior members of the Chinese Communist Party. People need to know that all of the members of the Politburo are billionaires. Where did they get their money? Well, they didn't get their money from the $5,000 a month salary they're officially paid by the Chinese Communist Party. They got their money by selling offices. They got their money by entering into secret deals with nominally private companies to protect the private company from the extortions of other Communist Party officials. So the whole system is based on, is run by this criminal conspiracy called the Chinese Communist Party, which doesn't have the interests of the Chinese people at heart, but which has the interests of its own members, its own party, and of course its own family.
Okay, and so for all those reasons that you just mentioned, you would say beyond a shadow of a doubt that China has entered a declining phase.
Absolutely, and the other reason I say that is that Xi Jinping is modeling himself on all things resembling Chairman Mao. He's got the personality cult. He has his collected works. In fact, he's really a high-tech version of Chairman Mao. There is actually in China an app, a Xi Jinping app, that you download on your phone. And you have to download the Xi Jinping app on your phone. And every day you have to read your Xi Jinping app and answer the questions so you know what the great leader of China is thinking. So the degree of ideological control in China that Xi Jinping is achieving, Mao Zedong back in the 1950s and 60s and 70s could only dream of. But again, he is a committed socialist, communist dictator, and he is busily destroying the free enterprise sector of the country. Now, we've seen that before. From 1949 to 1976, when Mao passed away, China was convulsed again and again and again in destructive political campaigns. From the anti-rightist campaigns of the early 50s to the land reform, to the Cultural Revolution, the Great Leap Forward, campaign after campaign after campaign, where politics was put in the lead and economic development was secondary. And when I first went to China, and remember, I was the first American social scientist allowed into China, and I can speak, read, and write Chinese. When I left Stanford University and went to live in China for a year in 1979, 1980, the people in my commune in South China told me that life had been better in 1949 than it was 30 years later in 1979. 30 years without significant progress. Why? Because Mao had taken China down the socialist road to ruin. And we've had since then 30 years of development, which was helped along by the United States, which allowed technology and capital to flow to China, which opened up its markets to China. But over the last 10 years, we have a repeat of the disasters of the 50s, 1950s and 1960s. We have Xi Jinping, the spiritual son of Mao Zedong, taking China once more down the socialist road to ruin. And it will not end well.
While I was preparing this interview, I was reviewing your life story. Yes, I read about that, but I also want to switch topics here now because you understand, and correct me if I'm wrong, that you became pro-life after that visit to China and witnessing women being forced to have abortion. Is that correct?
It is correct. I was in China in 1980 when the one-child policy began. I was there with the permission of the Chinese government, so I was able to see women as they were arrested for the crime of being pregnant. I was able to be with them as they were taken into morning to night brainwashing sessions. and told they had no choice but to get an abortion. And I was able to be with them as they were taken into the hospital and given lethal injections into their abdomen, into the womb, to kill their unborn children. And I was with them in the operating room when the Red Army doctors were opening them up and removing their now dead and dying babies by cesarean section abortion, something that the world has never heard of before. And I know that from 1980 to 2016, that there were 400 million unborn and newborn children killed in China. This is half of the last 2 generations. And it is crippling China's economic future. It has destroyed the Chinese family, and it has caused enormous suffering and anguish among the women who had their children killed in this way by orders of the party.
Which brings me to my next point. When you go to the website of the Population Research Institute, which is the organization you preside, and it says who we are, you talk about exposing the myth of overpopulation, which was the main reason given for the one-child policy of the Chinese government. Why is it a myth?
Well, it's a myth because it was propagated in the late 1960s by many people, including my friend, my colleague, never a friend, but colleague at Stanford University, biologist Paul Ehrlich, who wrote a book called The Population Bomb, which predicted that hundreds of millions of people were going to starve to death in the 1970s, 10 years later. That didn't happen. What did happen is the world, as we now see, is going through the demographic transition from high fertility and high mortality down to low mortality and low fertility. In fact, almost all the countries of the world outside of some sub-Saharan African countries are now having too few children to replace the current population. Their birth rate is below the number needed to maintain the current population. And so their populations over time, like China's, will begin to decline. The economic consequences of that will be devastating. This is uncharted territory. And we already have several dozen countries in Europe, Japan, South Korea, China, Singapore, other countries in absolute demographic decline, which will lead to at best, economic stagnation. At worst, it could lead to economic collapse. So what we saw after World War II was a one-time doubling in the world's population. We went from 3 billion to 6 billion from 1960 to 2000. Not because people started having large families, but because the infant and child mortality rates were coming down, because modern healthcare was reaching the village population of the world. And birth rates were falling, death rates were falling even faster. That's a one-time increase. The population of the world will never double again. And now we see that. Now people are beginning to recognize the problem. Elon Musk, for example, Twitter, has said that our long-term problem is not too many people, but too few people. Our problem is depopulation. I was writing about this in the pages of the Wall Street Journal back in the late 1990s, because you could see it happening in real time. And yet this movement called the population control movement, and this myth of overpopulation is still being used to encourage the sterilization, the contraception, and the abortion of women. And it's not an innocent myth, the myth of overpopulation. It is a myth that kills. It's a myth that killed and sterilized 300,000 women in Peru under President Fujimori back 30 years ago.
Now, your latest book is called The Devil in Communist China. You explore, among other ideas, this loss of God. For, man started its road to communism by rejecting God. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I think at the base of Marxist-Leninism is a hatred of God. I mean, underneath all of their political claims and their economic claims and their their ideological fantasies that we're going to create heaven on earth, is a rejection of God. And Chairman Mao is a perfect example of that. He said as a young man that he was lawless and godless. And I think that actually he got that backwards, because if you're godless, you're always going to be lawless over time, because the ultimate support for morality and ethics is a belief in a higher power. So he was godless and lawless. He also said as a young man that there are other people in the world and things in the world, but they were only there for his use and his pleasure. That is the classic statement of the materialistic view of the world, which doesn't regard fellow human beings as people deserving of rights or having an innate dignity, and certainly not possessing an immortal soul. No, the materialists, the atheists, those who reject God like Mao Zedong, regard other people merely as objects, as things to be used for their own pleasure, their own advancement. His view of the Chinese people was one of absolute disdain. He had no love for his fellow Chinese. In fact, when tens of millions of Chinese were dying in the 1960s, early 1960s, dying from a famine that he caused by the Great Leap Forward, he said, deaths have benefits. Their bodies fertilize the soil.
I remember
45
that, yeah.
million people died. 45 million people died in that famine. And all he could think about was how wonderful it was that these 45 million people, their bodies would fertilize the soil, would serve as human compost.
Yeah, and what about the agreement made between the Vatican and China and former Cardinal Theodore McCarrick's role in it? Why is that important?
Well, McCarrick, of course, has been laicized. He's no longer a cardinal. He never should have been a cardinal. He was a sexual predator. But he was tasked by Pope Francis 10, 12, 14 years ago to go to China and negotiate an agreement with the Chinese Communist Party. And so, predictably, the agreement has many, many problems, many, many flaws. I met with Cardinal Pietro Parolin in June of 2018 rather, when he was thinking about signing an agreement with the Chinese Communist Party, what's known as the Sino-Vatican Agreement. I told him that the Chinese Communist Party was only interested in infiltrating, seizing control of, and ultimately destroying the Catholic Church in China, and in the meantime, using it for its own purposes of propagating the party line. So I said it would be a very bad idea to sign the agreement. He said to me in June of 2018, I said 2019, but it's 2018, that actually, he said, we're simply waiting now for the Chinese side to sign because the agreement's already been negotiated. Well, I know that the agreement has never been signed, because Cardinal Parolin admitted last June, in June of 2023, that the reason why the agreement was still secret was because it was still provisional. It was still in the process of being negotiated with the Chinese side. So the Chinese Communist Party has never signed what's known as the Sino-Vatican Agreement. So the agreement doesn't exist. All that we have is a series of confessions made by the Vatican to the Chinese Communist Party in the hope that the Chinese Communist Party will be nice and reciprocate and treat Catholics in China better. And of course, that has not happened. That will never happen, because that's not the way the Chinese Communist Party operates. It uses negotiations for political purposes to advance its own cause, and its own goal is to destroy all religious faith in China, not just Catholicism, which is at the top of the list, but also all sects of Protestantism, Taoism, Buddhism, Tibetan Buddhism, Muslims in the far west. It wants to transform China into the Communist Church of China. It wants everyone to be faithful pew-sitters in the Church of China that it creates, in which the acolytes are Communist Party members, and the leader of the Church of China is the leader of the Communist Party, Xi Jinping, and the scriptures are the works of Xi Jinping himself.
All right. There it is. The book is called The Devil in Communist China. And Mr. Mosher, we appreciate your being here. You're welcome back anytime.
Thank you.
Nutrida entrevista. Ya les voy a dejar mis comentarios, mis conclusiones sobre la misma y lo que yo recojo de lo que me dijo Steven Mosher. Pero antes, hidrátate y siéntete increíble con Iglú. Disfruta de su variedad de productos, agua de mesa, en caja y en bidón para oficinas y su ya conocido hielo, por supuesto. Siempre contigo. Refresca tu vida. Elige Iglú. Para terminar, Steven Mosher, como ustedes han visto, debidamente sustenta todas sus posiciones, ¿no? Porque los más reacios a apoyar posturas como las que defiende Mosher seguramente dirán, bueno, es un loquito, algunos lo tildan de neoconservador, etcétera, pero todo está debidamente sustentado, desde donde recogió las cifras para su artículo sobre el declive económico de China, cómo se están quedando más de 65 millones de unidades de departamentos vacíos, cifras económicas, impuestos, todo lo que ustedes han visto ahí. Y la población también es numérica. Cuando estamos hablando de declive poblacional, esto se ata a los números, porque también tiene consecuencias económicas. Un placer entrevistar a Steven Mosher, desde luego que esperamos tenerlo nuevamente en edición especial digital. Son estas las entrevistas que más me gustan hacer a mí. Saquen ustedes sus propias conclusiones, déjenme en los comentarios sus impresiones, sus observaciones, sus sugerencias también para futuros invitados. Pero cuando uno habla con gente que domina lo que hace, que son voces autorizadas, son expertos, como en este caso el señor Mosher en la China comunista, es un placer poder conversar con él y aprender, y a su vez que mis esfuerzos les sirvan a ustedes también para sustentar sus posturas, nutrir sus mentes, y que de ese campo de abono fértil puedan ustedes emerger más enriquecidos. Y los que quieran dar batalla cultural, por supuesto, que ahí tienen más herramientas para hacerlo. Seguiremos. Y cada viernes, quiero anunciarles, cada viernes vamos a estar dejando en este programa entrevistas. Vale decir, aprovecho este episodio para anunciarle a toda mi audiencia que desde esta semana, como estamos haciendo con esta entrevista, nos vamos a alejar de la coyuntura netamente política peruana, salvo exista una cosa extraordinaria, ¿no? Vamos a ir con política peruana de coyuntura de lunes a jueves y los viernes voy a dejar entrevistas de valor, que no necesariamente estén relacionadas a la coyuntura política peruana. Ese será un aporte y una óptica distinta que les ofrece mi canal y su canal, desde luego. No olviden suscribirse, corran la voz, dejen sus comentarios, compartan el contenido en sus redes sociales y comenten. Yo me despido y nos reencontramos el día lunes. Muy buen fin de semana.